Well, welcome to the final panel today. I'd like to thank Free World Investment and the China Strategic Risk Institute and Democracy Investments, Julie, for inviting me to this conference, which has been very stimulating. The previous presentations have really been enlightening. Some fabulous information, very timely information. And we'll try to add to that. I'm Mike Cerre. I'm a special correspondent for the PBS NewsHour. But I must admit up front, I am not a China expert nor a finance expert. But being a correspondent, I always am used to being not the smartest guy in the room, but make sure I have the smartest guys in the room on these subjects around me, and I have them with me today. And so we have, as Daniel was saying, we're going to concentrate not only on the context of what we've been talking about, but also some of the solutions. And we've got this kind of trifecta of panelists here, Daniel in the human rights section and investment, and Matt being in intelligence and exports, and Rick being in investments and investment strategy. So that's how we're going to come at this thing. We're going to make it a little bit more conversational, not any presentations, and then we'll open up for some questions at the very end. So let's get going. But first, Daniel, why don't you introduce yourself? You can be more specific about your background for this.
Sure. So thank you, Mike. Here, I will just try to make an intro short. I think the last two panels, they give a very good context about the problem here. But I think what we want to make this session special, two things. First, solution-oriented. The second thing, to be as much interaction as possible. So we do welcome everyone to speak up if you want here. So I'm Daniel Wong, co-founder of Free World Investment. I'm originally from Hong Kong, and thank you, Mike, for giving me the last colonial smell from your can. And I feel like I always get some DNA for democracy because I was born in the year of 1989, just a month before the Tiananmen crackdown. I remember I couldn't remember it, but at least my mom told me that on the day of June 4th, she's like, commemorating, what is going on in Victoria Park, and I was in her belly at the time. So I feel like I got some DNA for this. And as someone who's born and raised in Hong Kong, we feel like it is actually the last bastion of freedom and democracy. Because if we lose Hong Kong, we can't just, if you can't afford like a house in Manhattan, you can move to somewhere else. Hong Kong is our last home for culture and everything here. After I finished my master in London School of Economics for global politics, I won a green card lottery, and I came to SFOO at the time to collect my green card. I feel like, and the world changed because 4 years ago, there was a massive protest in Hong Kong that kind of shaped my life. And then since then, I've been based in Washington, D.C. for advocacy effort here. And thanks to a lot of friends, in D.C., in London, and around the world as well, we've been fighting for Hong Kong human rights and democracy. We call it International Front. And I think right now, we do have the bipartisan support for Hong Kong, but what is missing out would be the misalignment from the business sector, corporate world. And that is why me and my co-founder, Larry Chan, actually co-founded a Free World Investment. Basically, we want to say that, hey, what we suffer in Hong Kong because of the economic infiltration that shaped Hong Kong, we don't want to see it to be repeated in the West, in America. Looking at the 380 billion trade deficit every single year, and we can't just award China from our investment. So basically, we started this company, asset management company, that we do conduct due diligence investigation in the S&P 500 companies, and to really just to share a portfolio that is really free from autocracy. And that is our first time doing this alongside APAC. So thank you guys for coming. We hope to do this again in the future. So thank you.
Now we're going to lean on Matt for the security perspective. And Matt told me while we were preparing for this that he was once tabbed with the moniker of being a real hardliner when it came to export controls, which he did do, serving in the embassy in Beijing. So Matt, tell us a little bit about your background here and how it relates to what we're talking about.
Yeah, to be specific, I was Fanhua, anti-China, so-called. Yes, my name is Matt. I write about Chinese espionage nowadays. I'm the co-author of a book on the subject. My background is academic study of the Chinese Communist Party's history. And I was a corporate investigator with a couple different MNCs for 17 years. 8 of those years in China, and I spent some time as a diplomat in China, doing trade promotion and export controls.
Well, I'm Rick Rikoski from Democracy Investments. We were started during COVID after realizing that authoritarianism was rising globally, right? Democracy is sort of in decline. The countries which are democratic are falling in the global rankings of population. And we realized that this is a real problem, but also that these countries were growing because of, economically, they were growing because of our own investment. And so we set up Democracy Investments, which you can read more about at democracyinvestments.com, specifically to address that problem. So in my role, I'm the chief economist. And what I do is I redesign stock indices to move money away from authoritarian states and towards democracies, with the intended effect of having democracies grow faster, while also providing an incentive for political reform among authoritarian states.
Well, the previous guests in the sessions have really laid out the situation in China and Hong Kong, and it's even more alarming than I even imagined. And given that, Daniel, since the passage of the National Security Law in 2020, what's the reality check on doing business in Hong Kong today?
Yes, this is also the main theme of today's the whole event here, is that I think the business should wake up here to really face squarely about the authoritarian reality of Hong Kong. Hong Kong has changed. Hong Kong is no longer that Hong Kong that used to be. It is somewhat like an ordinary Chinese city here. So as someone who is from Hong Kong here, we witnessed the change, the transformation of the landscape of Hong Kong in terms of business risks and in terms of the pretty much the spiritual landscape, everything. The smartest people in Hong Kong left. The foreign investors left here because of the erosion of human rights, the rule of law. So I would like to give it more extension of the panel 2 here, is that what is the pillar of the economic prosperity of Hong Kong? That would be the freedom, the rule of law. And the rule of law is actually protected and guaranteed by the one country, two systems, which give Hong Kong more like autonomy. But with the relentless control by the CCP right now, we just lost that autonomy and hence the rule of law. I would like to answer somewhat like a previous question from the previous question from the session 2 here about the national security law, and if you enter Hong Kong, is it still safe to even do a transit? And I would like to say that when we Hong Kongers talk about national security law, one significance about national security law is not only it is extraterritorial, it's even extraterrestrial. Because in the Article 38, it actually affects the non-Hong Kong citizens living outside of Hong Kong. So literally, in terms of the legal framework, we are all kind of illegal here.
Matt, we saw in the earlier presentations the decline, the flow of money out, the flow of people out. Did that surprise you, the rate? And what do you think the rate's going to be 23, 24, and 25?
Well, one of the aspects of the national security law was the establishment, of course, of a security headquarters that included people from the Central Discipline Inspection Commission, the Ministry of State Security, and the Ministry of Public Security. And this has led to a absorption of the Hong Kong police force into the policy priorities of Beijing. So with developments like that, and with the increasing risk of being accused arbitrarily of crimes against the state, which even includes historical nihilism, which means talking about history in a way that is not in agreement with the CCP, with rising risks like that, as well as what we saw with the two Michaels who were detained for political reasons. There's inevitably going to be a flow of capital outside of Hong Kong that will continue. Indeed, on the mainland, when I talk to people from the mainland and they talk to me about how their families are trying to move money overseas themselves, it seems like the controls there are not entirely watertight.
And Rick, you don't seem surprised by this evolution from your analysis of the Chinese and the art of the deal. In some ways, are you not surprised about this total reversal in the original agreement with the British and how fast this has gone?
I guess I'm not particularly surprised. I think back on on Bill Browder, actually, and Magnitsky in Russia, right? Bill Browder goes to Russia, thinks he's got some great investments, he's making some money. And they decide, hey, the foreigner's making too much money. And they essentially surreptitiously confiscate his company and kill his lawyer, right? And then one of Julie's friends, Patrick Genevine, he had a company with, there was a partnership with AVIC, the aviation company of China. And it was basically the same story. The foreigner was making too much money, and this led to a huge lawsuit in the US. Eventually he won, right? But what happened with Hong Kong? Again, they just canceled the deal. And this is really troublesome if you want to go and do business over there, because you can't trust that the deal will be honored. This means you need to bake in a larger risk premium than you think. And that, I think, in the long run is going to actually stifle the Chinese economy.
Someone mentioned earlier on that one of the Chinese officials said the agreement with the British really has no relevance at all. You still have one thing in Hong Kong, 2047, going to one currency away from the one country, two currencies now. Is that the final shoe it's going to drop, and will it drop before 47?
The first thing is that never really trust what the Chinese government said to you. They have a brilliant history of breaking their own promises, right? I think this is not only about what you see on WTO since 2001. This is what CCP, the DNA, is about, because they actually conquered China using what they call United Front strategy, just to divide the enemies. Okay, and I would just make friends, and then they infiltrate your country or your party, right? They did the same thing to Hong Kong, did the same thing to Kuomintang, and now they're doing the same thing to the West. So you see on APEC, right? It seems like Xi Jinping or Chinese authorities trying to buy some Boeing airplanes, right? Just please America, like they always do. And I am becoming surprised why the business community is still trusting China. But you raise a very legitimate concern here, one country, two currencies. And I think before that, I would like to give a more like a business context or the compliance risk about Hong Kong is that, well, I think what national security law lay out the context is not only affecting the human rights activists in Hong Kong, they literally affect every foreign business in Hong Kong, the foreign investors. I come from a due diligence background. Whenever you do a background check for a company or individual, you have to run what they call the OFAC list, Office of Foreign Asset Control, right? To see what individuals or corporates are being sanctioned, okay? So right now, recently the Congress already introduced the Hong Kong Sanction Act, and even the chief executive, John Lee, is barred from entering the APEC, entering the United States, because he is currently sanctioned. So what happened is that in Article 29 of National Security Law, it means that if you take any direct, instruction from foreign government per se, like running a simple due diligence in Hong Kong, because it's being sanctioned by the United States, you could literally be accused for, violating NSL here. They're not doing their prosecution yet, doesn't mean that they're not doing that in the future. This is a compliance risk. And the second one is that actually Hong Kong is turning itself from a global financial hub to a sanction-busting hub. Just in last year alone, in between 2021 and 2022, the Russian entities, the Iranian entities actually doubled for the registration in Hong Kong. They actually welcome this kind of money laundering. And even there's a yacht ship, a ship in Hong Kong, But then the John Lee, our chief executive at that time, saying that we do not need to comply with the United States sanction because we do not respect the unilateral sanction here. But imagine that how do we have the multilateral sanction if Russia and China is still sitting on the United Nations Security Council? That would be literally impossible.
So Matt, would that be pretty obvious to you? You've been around that part of the world quite a bit. Would it be pretty obvious to you who's moving into the international finance community in China as the more respectable finance community leaves? With that vacuum, who moves in? I mean, do you think we've been told a lot of money laundering, money going into Ukraine, coming out of Russia, around oil? Do you get a sense, if it's no longer a credible international marketplace, is it still a pretty vibrant financial trade center?
Well, with the way things are going now, it seems as if the probability is that China will reorder its financial links with the outside world and will offer incentives to other countries that have more authoritarian systems that do not have a questioning public that would interfere with the flow of capital by protesting human rights and other things. So I would expect to see more links with other countries that do not have to put up with democratic contests in their own national elections.
Let's put it in the context of what's happening here in San Francisco today with the big meeting between the two presidents. They're saying that's on the Chinese agenda is to try to woo businesses back. There's a big dinner tonight, high-ticket dinner with American businessmen. How can the Chinese make the case to woo American businesses back to China if the flow of capital is as great as we've been hearing? Rick, you want to take that?
Oh, that's a tough one for them.
Tough one for you too, but I mean, what case can they make? I mean, other than the propaganda case that everything is fine.
It's the same case they've been making for, what is it, almost 50 years now. Access to cheap labor, but the labor's not so cheap anymore, right? China's per capita GDP is the same as Mexico's, which is the same as Russia's actually. There are a lot of options at that price point. Yeah, as a prior speaker mentioned, there's still, I guess, 500 million people earning less than $5 a day. But there are people like that in Mexico too. So China has to compete on other things they can do. Can they be lower risk? Because, and I guess their version of it is because they are they're authoritarian, so they can ensure that the workers do what they're supposed to do, which I think would have Marx rolling over in his grave.
But is there anything they could do to stem the flow? Matt, I mean, is it, this is a very serious flow of venture capital has left a long time ago. Someone else is making the point that all the hedge funds are out. What case can they make?
Well, as we heard from someone who spoke up, I don't see him right now, who spoke up a couple hours ago, who's done business with AVIC, the Aviation Corporation of China. The Beijing government continues to want to have certain technologies imported into China, continues to want to have some forms of investment, but it seems, unless they are unconscious about what they're doing, it seems like what they're trying to do is to winnow out businesses that they don't need anymore. The businesses that they do want have the technologies that they are seeking. And one of the recent signs about what technologies they're seeking a couple of years ago was, of course, the arrest in Belgium of the State Security Bureau officer named Shi Yanjun, who had contacted someone in GE engines trying to get their carbon fan blade technology. And he went a little bit too far, was a little bit too risky in his tradecraft, and he was arrested and extradited to the U.S. And now he's serving a 20-year prison sentence. But these areas of technology will continue to be sought, and it seems like we're kind of going back toward the Mao period in some ways. And the reason I say that is because the controls of information, for example, that are putting off so many foreign businesses where you can't do due diligence anymore. It's very reminiscent of the period in the 1950s and into the 1970s when even the most mundane information was classified. And so businesses that can put up with that and have something solid and valuable to offer the Chinese side will probably continue to do business in China.
You know, there's this very obvious distrust between the two governments. Can business step in and take a leadership role here in changing this dynamics, either on the human rights basis, financial basis? Can business take a role here?
Definitely. Two layers here, like in terms of one, maybe external communication, and one thing is more internal operation here. Externally, right, we do think that business play a crucial role in actually lobbying the Hong Kong or even Chinese authorities to face what are the consequences here. Because, you know, I think like China, what is China seriously? I think like they are quite delusional because on one hand, they're trying to seize more capital control, like, you know, trying to control everything, but now they're trying to get more foreign business here. Oh, I think just a week ago, we are seeing that there's a negative deficit of FDI, the foreign investment coming to China, which is the first time ever. It's like kind of breaking the record here. And even now, just this week here or last week, there's Ministry of State Security in China here announced that if you are doing a negative economic forecast in China, you'll be actually flattening the state secret, which would basically, you know, imprison you, right? But I think right now, in terms of external communication, is that any businesses who are still thinking that it's too big to fail, to withdraw or even divest from Hong Kong to China, they play a huge role in telling the official, like squarely, what is going to happen.
Well, in that regard, do they have any leverage? I mean, in other words, is the flow of foreign capital and investments so great that they can address this with them at all? Or is the Chinese government going to give them a blind eye and say, you want to do business, you're going to do it our way or no way?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's exactly why the corporate world needs a really more unified voice among themselves here. I think it's kind of sad to see that there's not like a single metric for the ongoing ESG here. Like, you know, there's a joke saying that the best way to improve your ESG score is to change the US ESG provider, because there are actually more than 600 of ESG providers here, and everyone mostly focus on E, environment. No one talk about S. Where's human rights? But actually, there's a fundamental pillar here, so it's more like solution side. Actually, we need to look at the convention. In United Nations, there's what they call a United Nations guiding principle on business and human rights. It's a very good like context about what should business do when it comes to human rights. And one of the first things is to conduct a human rights due diligence. I'm surprised that in my background of due diligence analyst, like I've been doing a lot of investigation on different corporates. I have done almost zero investigation when it comes to human rights. Even BlackRock, right, who is one of the biggest, like, you know, ESG supporter, Larry Fink, he said that, oh, China's doing so great, let's triple our amount. And one thing is that, like, BlackRock has been claiming itself to be one of the best ESG supporter here. Back in March 2022, right after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, they've been saying that, hey, because of this ongoing conflict, let's buy in more natural gas. Let's get in more crude oil equities from Russia, because they think that they speculated this kind of related equities will climb up. But what happened is that they failed to address that. They failed to speculate that the political backlash that the Congress and EU would kick Russia out of the SWIFT system. Eventually, almost 17 or 30 billion losses suffered by all those investors we have here.
But Daniel, even if business is blind to the human rights and the ethical considerations, Rick, what are the biggest, if you had to tick off three big business fears doing business in China right now, what would you list them as?
I would say the national security law for sure. It's, among other things, one of the basic assumptions of an efficient market is just having access to information, right? And so as soon as you undermine that, that's really bad. Secondly, the Communist Party sells inside your company. That's a mess. And when they're telling you basically about business decisions that you can't make, like, oh, you've got a product line and it's obsolete, but you can't shut down the factory because they want you to continue to employ those people. Well, that's another classic economic assumption about, mobility of resources or whatever it's called. But again, that's another basic core assumption. You don't have, attorney-client privilege. You don't have intellectual property law. There's, how do you make rational decisions when, literally one of the three non-kinetic warfares is media warfare, right? Trying to undermine people's understanding of what's going on. So pretty much every single thing that you see the Chinese government doing that you don't like from a business perspective, also coincidentally is destroying one of the assumptions that you would like to see if you want to be involved in a market where you can make some money.
What's the most important metric here, Matt, when you take a look at it? Is it the flow of capital going out, or is it the supply chain diversions and whatever? How do businesses vote their concerns?
Well, certainly Apple has already begun voting in this regard by moving their supply chains partly out of China. It's going to be very difficult for businesses to entirely de-risk, 100% de-risk or decouple from China, and I don't think we should expect that at the present time. It would probably take a cataclysmic event such as war with Taiwan and war with the US to accomplish that sort of thing. But I think the metrics that we should look at will be complicated because each business will have to decide for itself what is in the best interest of their shareholders when it comes to de-risking, and that's going to be different from industry to industry.
I might want to say, well, I would say from my research, actually, there are actually some concrete things that could be done. It's not like too big to fail, but actually you can do something here. The first thing apart from the human rights due diligence I was talking about here, I think there are actually some guiding principles, like I said, from the UN guiding principle. There's some, just say, for example, right? When you follow the US sanctions strictly, it's not only about not to do any business dealings with these countries, but you do not just, it comply to that. That also means that you stop going to those, like, for example, like Hong Kong government, just as, organized the Global Financial Leaders Investment Summit. By just attending that event, actually implicitly mean that you are actually supporting the Hong Kong government. Say for HSBC, for example, right? They're facing like a serious compliance risk that they, on one hand, they're claiming that, oh, I'm gonna respect the ESG, but on the other hand, they actually close down the activist bank account like Cerre, which I find is ridiculous here. And another thing is that if you comply to that, that means you stop selling any sort of like sensitive technologies or even like weaponry equipment to the Hong Kong police force here. And like Mercedes, when you go to Hong Kong, all those police vans are Mercedes-Benz.
And Matt, does that work? You worked in Beijing. You were in the export control office in Beijing. How serious of a threat is that if, as Dan was saying, cut off those exports of critical technology, critical supplies, whatever? Is that a really serious threat? Does that have any teeth?
It does. After the Cold War in 1990, when I was working in the Office of Export Enforcement, our senior management went to Eastern Europe to interview people in Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia about the effect of US export controls. And unanimously, they said, what a pain in the ass. Everything was more expensive. It took a lot longer to acquire. after-sales service and spare parts were impossible. And I think this is one of the reasons why the Chinese side has, ever since I was doing that work in the early 90s and up until the present day, the Chinese side is vociferous in their opposition to US export controls. These controls are not perfect. You know, in export controls, there's export controls where you have to get a license to an individual validated license to ship some product to a particular end user in a place like China. And then there's embargo. Embargo is like what we have on North Korea and Cuba. So the US government is not trying to embargo China. That would be almost impossible. They have export controls on shipments to China. And there's always going to be ways to get around that. But the point is that it's going to make it more expensive, slower, more time, and make it more difficult to do after-sales service and get spare parts.
So it is an effective tool for affecting change.
If it wasn't effective, the Chinese would not be complaining.
Good indication. That's a leading indicator, huh? Before we talk about the solution side, about actually investing in China, let's go back to something, again, Matt, it's in your expertise. If you are doing business in China right now, what kind of protocols do you need to establish within your company to deal with the new realities?
The risks that people face now in doing business in China include detention of local employees, detention of expat employees, and stopping shipments in order to dig into them for trade secrets, and so on. So it's important for businesses to, first of all, have a good China law firm to represent them. And this ideally should be a law firm, I won't name names, but there are plenty of them in China, a law firm from Europe or the US or Canada, et cetera, that has offices there and local staff. Second, whenever something happens like an employee is detained and such, management immediately goes crazy because it's a potential disaster both for the brand and for the business. And so to prepare for that, businesses should have committees to deal with these things. They need an insider threat committee in case they discover that they might have a spy within their lab. They need a serious incident committee to handle these things so that senior management doesn't have to be involved every minute of the day in trying to resolve the problems. But above all, I think people have to recognize that this is a very unusual situation, and they need to take sober steps to handle this situation. And they shouldn't give up. For example, a lot of people give up on doing background investigations of potential new hires in China because they think it's impossible. Well, it's not impossible. There are companies in China that are still doing these investigations. Their data is not worthless. It should be taken with a grain of salt, but you can supplement that by having a company, a professional company outside of China, do the sort of web-based and proprietary database searches that can also be done on individuals and potential business partners.
Daniel, I mean, let's do a gut check. If you were back in Hong Kong doing business, would you be using burner phones? Would you have safe houses? I mean, how fast has it deteriorated?
No, I mean, well, I can go back to Hong Kong, I think, if I don't want to come back. So it's really deteriorating very rapidly. I just say, for example, right, if you go to Google Map, there's this function called Google Map Wheel that you can see all those years, right? Compared 10 years ago, every single year, you can just take a look in the street of Hong Kong and how many businesses shut down over the years. That's how you can see in a very apparent wheel here. But just to talk about what apart from Hong Kong, what we can learn from that, because like we are starting here like at ABC this HK conference because we think that that would be the next step of the advocacy, because Hong Kong is quite unique in the sense that it is a financial hub after New York and London. And one can never imagine that there will be more than 1,700 political prisoners in Hong Kong right now. And what that indicates, that means the erosion of the rule of law. And I can tell you not only that they are facing life sentences, but most of them actually being detained for more than 2 years without giving a trial. And I would say that if there's like a complete decoupling, what would China potentially do would be the kidnapping diplomacy, right? Imagine how many like Canadians is in Hong Kong, US citizens in Hong Kong, foreign business in Hong Kong. And currency risk I want to respond to you here is that Hong Kong is such an ATM for China, right? So that they can get the US dollars, right? Because they have the currency control. But look at right now, with what happened in the China Evergrande, and it's not only just slowdown of the economic growth. China is facing a recession right now, and what they want is to control the capital within China. The best way to get your capital out from mainland China is still through Hong Kong, right? If they want to protect this currency for the capital outflow, they are going to control Hong Kong dollar. I'm not too sure about what is the future of Hong Kong dollar. I'm not saying that there will be a packing between renminbi and Hong Kong dollar, but it's still useful. But Hong Kong dollar will play a much less significant role than before. And that is a fact, and that is exactly what the businesses should face in the future.
Okay, let's talk about the individual investor. We promised solutions. Rick, you run a fund over there. Does it necessarily mean zero investment? Just do not invest in anything over there?
You can do it either way. Some funds, for instance, will cut out certain countries entirely. They'll, cut out Russia, China, et cetera. Sometimes they do that actively managed, where they then take the subset of stocks and cherry pick some. Other funds like Daniel's, for instance, they actually focus on domestic companies and more how they behave internationally, right? What their exposures are. What we do is we do the entire world. We own everything. We're completely in China. We just give them a lot less money because we tie it to a democratic metric, right? And so there's a whole bunch of different ways you can approach this problem. And in fact, arguably none of them are wrong. What matters the most is simply thinking about it and doing something. And when you do that, and you kind of collectively participate like that, you create a demand curve, right? And China becomes aware of that demand curve and realizes that if they reform, they get more money.
So Matt was saying export controls work. If you don't invest in China or Hong Kong, what's the return on investment for a stockholder? Can they do as well by investing in democratic countries versus non-democratic countries?
Short answer, yes. Longer answer is I think that there's a fallacy that high GDP growth correlates with high investment returns. I went and I looked at I did a comparison of the BRICS countries versus the G8 for the last 10 years. All the G8 countries had positive returns. Only India and China had positive returns among the BRICS. And they were not outstanding by G8 standards. So realistically, yeah, you don't have to go and put your money into a rapidly growing authoritarian state because you're not going to miss out. I can't say that because I can't predict the future. But, in general, I would not be afraid of missing out.
And do these funds generally track fairly well? Julie, when you gave me my first introduction to democracy funding, the first thing you said, you knew the question I was going to ask. How do they perform? And you said they can hold their own. Can these funds, without these investments in China, can they hold their own?
Yeah, you can construct portfolios that have extraordinarily high correlation coefficients.
And how do you know if the portfolio you have through an index fund or through a money manager or something like that has a exposure to China. Is it easy to find that out, or do you think some people would be surprised what kind of exposure they do have in their own portfolios?
I think it's actually usually pretty easy to figure out if you look. The real thing is most people don't look.
Right. They don't know if they got Alibaba or whatever.
Well, and a lot of people, they've got 401k plans they set up 20 years ago and left on autopilot, right?
Dan?
So when I came to this country 5 years ago, I felt like everyone was talking about free trade, free market, but interestingly, no one talked about free choice. See, when we talk about ESG and everyone, like 20 years ago, even before ESG, people talk about CSR, right? Corporate social responsibility. People talk about climate change. And I think the solution part here starts from bottom up, not just top down, like the US is going to sanction you, whatever, right? That's why FWI, our company, like Democracy Investment here, we're trying to promote a concept for investment approach that align with human rights and democracy here. It's just like, it's the same thing that people did for promoting climate change, ESG companies. In terms of return here, I think first thing is that before we talk about return, we have to promote awareness. Almost when you invest like MSCI or all those like, all those like a JP Morgan ESG emerging fund, 36% of the ESG JP Morgan emerging fund, Freedom House find that 36% of this ESG fund is not free. You don't have a choice. If you talk to your asset managers, hey, I don't want to invest in Russia or China. They were like, yeah, invest in Apple, invest in Tesla. Is that the difference here? You got a factory in Shanghai, right? So, I mean, right now, like, just to share what like our company, the methodology is that it's just to let these companies also get a chance to conduct due diligence by themselves here. So like our portfolio here, for example, right? For all those like S&P companies here, we look at three things. First, supply chain. We want to know to what extent they got their supply chain, their branch office, the infrastructure assets being sourced from China, Russia, Venezuela, North Korea, so to speak. The second is the revenue. To what extent they earn the money from the free world versus autocracy. And the third thing is more like a subjective approach. What do the CEO side with when it comes to the rivalry between US and China? Do they have the rhetoric that was more like trying to please the CCP here? It's just like a way that people can actually do something. In terms of return, I can't give you like a 3-year, 5-year track record yet, but at least last year that has been pretty impressive because just last year alone we have by mitigating those geopolitical risks by excluding autocracy. Our portfolio have actually outperformed the S&P by 8% and Nasdaq 100 QQ by more than 15%. I cannot just say that because we actually mitigated those geopolitical risks or exclude China, but at least, hey, we are doing something. So that's why we are trying to say there could be a best of both worlds when you respect those morality, which comes with a better return. So why not?
So is the ultimate due diligence and fiduciary responsibility here to look at these countries that you're investing in? Because what's happening in China and Hong Kong is kind of what's happening in many other parts of the world as autocracies gain strength here. Do you think it's beyond an investment decision, but a moralistic decision of you've got to vote on whether you want to protect democracies or finance autocracies? Maybe Rick on this one. Rick, you were saying that, this is happening. This is a trend that's happening in places other than just Hong Kong.
Well, first of all, we think of a world order which is dominated by the European countries. In truth, if you look at the 20 largest countries on Earth by population, the third largest, the U.S., is probably there's us, there's Japan at about, I think, 11th or 12th in population, and Germany at 19th. And then the rest of them are not strong democracies at all. And Germany's going to fall out of that list within 10 years, Japan within about 20, right? And the U.S. is going to be holding its own because we have strong immigration. But there's a lot of very authoritarian countries moving up the rankings very fast. Nigeria just passed Brazil, okay? Mexico passed Russia. That's not that big a deal, but they will both be passed soon. Russia and Mexico will not be top 10 countries within 10 years. Ethiopia moves in the top 10, as does the Democratic Republic of the Congo. They're 16th right now. They're growing exceptionally fast. And if you look at democracy scores, they're right there in the cellar next to North Korea, right? So we've got to worry about how are we going to guide the world towards a soft landing when the democratic countries we depend on have shrinking influence relatively.
And Daniel, you say Hong Kong isn't Tibet. There can be an economic influence on what happens to Hong Kong. It's a vibrant economy. It's an important economy. So do you think, like what happened to South Africa in the mid-'80s, that if businesses really get together and make a conscious decision of where they want to invest their money, can change the geopolitics?
Yeah, thank you for bringing about the South Africa, and I think that also relates to solution, because back in the 80s, right, there's an epithet, right, racial segregation, and what really actually changed that status quo would be the corporate response, not only sanctions, not only top-down effort, but the bottom-up advocacy here, and that is why I feel like actually we can improve like the status quo in Hong Kong. We can. We can. It's not just like pessimistic Hong is gone. We can do something here. So one thing is that, like, you look at the Hong Kong here, I think John Lee have been trying to, chief executive has been trying to emphasize like a propaganda that business as usual, which is definitely not the case, as you see in the previous panel here. I'm not a hardliner in the sense I would say for, hey, complete divestment, because of its ongoing geopolitical risk. Well, what happened in Hong Kong is not just a Hong Kong issue. It is a global issue. Look at history. What happened after Hong Kong protests? COVID-19. What causes COVID-19 to get spread to the world? It's because the Chinese Communist Party has been trying to hide its information from the international community that affected every single countries in the world. Just the United States alone, 7 million died from COVID-19, which is the combination of one is First World War, Second World War, and Vietnam combined. And what after COVID, that would be the Russian invasion of Ukraine here. And now I don't know about Taiwan. But hey, I mean, what I'm trying to give up the context is not about Hong Kong, but that since 2019, the world has changed. It is no longer, we are living in an era of globalization. Just look at the street of San Francisco. It's so empty. But it's kind of clean this week. But what happened is that I'm trying to say that what should corporate respond, not only to Hong Kong, to China, but what corporate business should respond when we are entering the context of Cold War 2.0?
Yeah, but who does that? You go back to South Africa, that time in the mid-'80s, it seemed like it was bottom up. It was the education, the pension funds. People were saying, we don't want to be invested there. And the corporations finally, IBM, Pepsi, they moved out. Is that fast enough, or does that come top down? Do the top Fortune 500 companies have to say, we're not doing business here? Rick?
I don't know that the South Africa model is going to work with China because it's just too big, right? With South Africa, you could cut off their access to oil. They had to make their own gasoline out of coal, if I'm not mistaken, right? Using some old crazy Nazi process. These are not things that are going to work with China because it's just too big and too diversified.
Matt, you agree? This is a different 900-pound gorilla?
Yeah, for not only for those practical reasons, but also for political ones, because the pressure from the bottom up regarding South Africa was based on very strongly held social justice concerns, among other things. And for better or for worse, that works to a degree with China, but the social justice concerns, even though they might be widely held in this room, the social justice concerns are not as widely held by Western publics in general.
Okay. Well, thank you all. And we'll open up for questions here. If someone has a question, I'd love to hear from you. I see someone way in the back there, back behind.
Yeah, thank you for presenting, and a good follow-up to the previous panel. So Two things. First is that what have you been observing? Say, what has been holding some of those business back? Since my impression is a lot of companies have been taking a very reactive approach to much of this. Say, is it fear of what the Communist Party of China is going to do? For example, like this is what happened back in summer of 2019 with Cathay Pacific, how given 49% of their air passengers are from mainland China, that the Communist Party, they managed to pressure them, and successfully in that case, to at least rescind, like just roll back a lot of the freedoms like around expression that used to offer their employees, which they used to be known for, like those situations. So is it fear of the Communist Party? Is it something else? Is it just complacency? And secondly is that even with just the deferring, you said, Rick, you mentioned both ways it could work, whether you divest entirely from it or you stay engaged, that do you see much scope for engaging in certain themes? For example, themes that generally are less likely to bleed into these geopolitical tensions, but more like, I think Gavin Newsom, he went to China specifically on the question of climate action, for instance. So do you see the potential in focusing on case-by-case basis these particular themes that potentially, I mean, at the very least, it wouldn't exacerbate tensions or such, it wouldn't, yeah, still may enable, of course, of the authoritarian governments, but at the very least may be able to nudge them towards a more positive
So
direction.
if I get it correctly, your question is, can this take, like climate change, can this take an ESG dynamics to really affect change in the business climate there? And Rick, you want to try to take that on? I mean, or Matt, go ahead.
On the U.S. side, the principal problem is our quarterly returns issue, where quarterly returns are the most important business consideration to satisfy shareholder value. And so U.S. companies are constantly, I'm saying this as a former commercial officer who used to counsel U.S. companies in China. U.S. companies are focused entirely on the short term, and they don't think about the long term. And this has to do with the people on the board and how many shares they hold and so on and so forth. And then on the Chinese side is used to linking everything together in order to get their own way. They do not typically go for two-track solutions. They want to, the perfect example is the Chinese military's refusal to continue to have a hotline-type communication with the U.S. military because we won't do what they want on Taiwan. So they are stubborn and do not want to give ground, and they reckon, based on past experience, that sooner or later they'll prevail.
So I'll add a slightly different take. There's a book I read about 10 years ago, The Rise of China versus the Logic of Strategy, by Ludwig, and he describes what he describes, he calls it great state autism. This notion that as your country gets bigger and bigger, your leader has to deal with more and more problems, and so they have less and less time to think about anything else and become irrational, right? I think that's true of a CEO of a major company. They have so much on their plate, they simply avoid anything that's not a screaming problem. So if it's not broken, don't fix it, and they're not being forward-thinking about these issues, right? Secondly, on the question about in terms of investing, there is an explosion of thematic exchange-traded funds right now. There's a new one launching, a couple new ones probably every day. I get emails from the New York Stock Exchange constantly. So yeah, they're out there on all sorts of topics. Frankly, some of them, I mean, they're created and destroyed about at an equal pace because they're not all survivors. But there's a lot of them being experimented with right now.
And you guys are talking about it from the C-suite perspective. What about from the personal investor's perspective? If I think I heard in your question was, will it rise the level of concern over climate change and other issues, on other ESG issues? Do you think democracy versus autocracy will quickly rise up in the ESG concern level?
I think it's trending up. The climate and environmental funds have been around longer, so they have more traction. But yes, democracy is gaining traction.
Before talk about the solution, right? It's realistic to acknowledge the challenges. I think first of all, the biggest challenges of incorporating democracy and human rights for ethical investing is that geopolitical risk itself is so hard to quantify, correct? When we look at 10K report, right, it's not like a requirement, right, to say like to what extent or revenue, right, or supply chain, every single, like even for supply chain itself, right, you can work with Chinese vendor, right, but you don't really have to list up every single vendor, right? But I think that could be something that could be done both top down and bottom up. Okay, top down is that when you look at the compliance risks here, well, it is the duty of you every single global like transnational corporation MNC to conduct a due diligence, to look at the SDN lists, and to look at who's the one being sanctioned here. But then if you receive a demand from Hong Kong or Chinese government, right? Say for example, when their pillar of shame, right, which is the one that commemorating the victims of the June 4th victims in University of Hong Kong, the statue itself is being removed, forcibly removed. That would be a law firm, it's Henry Brown, that actually wrote a letter so that I have to force you to remove that, right? But that actually violated the human rights, which is the freedom of speech and NSL and all that, right? I think corporations and companies have the duties to publicize those unreasonable demands that made by the Hong Kong government and Chinese government. Because once you report that and make it transparent, you're actually creating a momentum that, hey, when it comes with a dynamic between profit and business interests, I saw a profit that would improve your corporate image. And for bottom up here, I think every investors do not underestimate yourself. We play a crucial role in actually affecting those board of directors, the C-suite, in actually making their human rights due diligence to be more transparent, especially when it comes to Uyghurs, Hong Kong, and even Taiwan. And look at just I think people are doing the thing here, for example, MSCI, they have been trying to follow the suit of the U.S. sanction to remove a lot of questionable Chinese entities from the investment portfolio, say iFlyTech, right, and Sinopec. And I think we should keep doing, and not only those sanctioned entities, even Alibaba, Tencent, right? Because China is so notorious in trying to create what they call the dual use fusion type of technology or corporate civil corporation that actually integrate the use of military and the use of civility. So basically, we as investors should have the responsibility to encourage, to say to the board of directors, you should stop that and make it more transparent. So we can do something here from now and on.
Thank you for your question.
So I go first. Okay, so yeah, thank you for your your insights. I just want to qualify my discussion on financial institutions and Hong Kong specifically. So certain CEOs of financial institutions gathered in Hong Kong to discuss their future and also the future of Hong Kong, and that's kind of a sign to me that they are still having a fantasy to stay in Hong Kong market, trying to flourish there, and then but on the other hand, Daniel also mentioned that the number of registration of Russian entities like in Hong Kong doubled in the past years, and like aggressively thinking there may be more hot money from like maybe Russia or some like Middle East or something like that is having hostile relations with US, and then they will just like go, that companies will just go like IPOs or like go unlisted in Hong Kong. So there may be still a room for investment or for earnings for the financial institutions. So how alluring do you think the potential earnings in Hong Kong can can make the financial institutions to take the risk and like continue to their business in Hong Kong? And how deterring do you think that the ethnical consideration and also the human rights issue can like deter the financial institutions to get rid of like Hong Kong and invest in other finance markets? Yeah, thank you.
Oh, sure. Well, when you make a business decision, you don't look at just the status quo, like a GDP, everything. You look at the future, right? You want to look at the prospect of that particular jurisdiction. Like just in 2021, Heritage Foundation have dropped Hong Kong from from its ranking. It's not Hong Kong has been ranked as #1. Second will be Singapore, but they not only try to make Hong Kong as #2, but Hong Kong was actually delisted from the whole index. And that's why this time we have the pleasure to invite Fraser Institute this time to see why Hong Kong is not still dropped, and how, if by not dropping them, how will we be able to articulate to the Hong Kong government that what can corporate should do in response to the continuation of the erosion of the freedom and human rights in Hong Kong. Well, when it comes to about like whether or not these businesses are still investing in Hong Kong or not here, I think one of the biggest, they do a lot of cost and benefit analysis here. And I think this is not only about Hong Kong issue. They have to compare between the biggest economy, which is China, the second biggest economy, and then what's the alternative solution, like India. This time, I think one of the, this is APEC, right? We talk about Asia Pacific. But what I realize is that United States has been trying to push not only to include APEC, but they've been pushing Indo-Pacific, which basically includes India here. So if China loses its economic significance in the future, not only because of the erosion of the human rights in Hong Kong, but also because of the downward trajectory of the Chinese economy as a whole, what would be the alternative if it comes to India? Why still bother investing in Hong Kong? Because the only attractiveness of Hong Kong is because it is a gateway, economic gateway, given of the rule of law and autonomy, which is now vanished.
Rick Rikoski, thank you for your insights. Matt Brazil, thank you for yours. Daniel, for yours. And we hope we covered some of the areas of concern for all of you. Thank you for joining us today.